We welcome Jake Rowe from Dogs HQ, and Georgia had a scrimmage on Saturday. The big news, at least if you're a head football coach, not a lot of injuries, nothing more than bumps and bruises. So the Kirby Smart and company very happy about that. But Jake, let's talk about this team and where it's at right now, because obviously huge expectations. They're the preseason number one in the coaches poll. We'll see what happens in the AP poll, but this is a team that everybody expects to compete for the national title. Does it feel like enough players are stepping forward, that have to be stepping into roles, replacing really good players?
Yeah, that in a lot of ways, Andy, that's almost exactly what it feels like. It feels like that's kind of the story of camp is Georgia was needing someone to kind of step up and help Trevor Etienne there at the running back position, and now Branson Robinson's back and he looks good, and Nate Frazier has been as advertised. They were looking for kind of depth at outside linebacker, and there's a couple of guys stepped up there. You look at the secondary, and Dan Jackson has been everything you thought he would be in terms of experience, but KJ Bolden, his talent is kind of showing through. They've got a really good battle at cornerback. Jonel Aguero and Ja'Cory Thomas are working there, that star position. So all the questions you kind of had about this team coming into this part of the year have kind of been answered. The only really one setback they've had is kind of a little bit of a longer term injury to Jordan Hall, a sophomore defensive lineman who, when you looked at Georgia's defensive line, whether they went into the portal or not after the season, it was going to depend on Jordan Hall's improvement and Christian Miller's improvement. Well, Jordan Hall is probably going to miss the first month of the season. So that's, kind of on the negative side of the development, but a lot of questions have been answered or are on their way to being answered in Georgia preseason camp right now.
I noticed you almost said Jared Wilson, the center.
Yeah,
he's been dealing with something too. So what's his situation right now?
Well, I'll tell you what, Andy, I don't expect that one to be a long-term deal. I think that's one of those things where he's got I think he's got some foot or some ankle soreness going on, and they're just trying to make sure, hey, listen, we're gonna use this time to get Tate Ratledge and Drew Bobo up to speed, as the next man up. But let's give you about a week, maybe a week and a half, to kind of get that, get that injury in place and kind of get pain free, and then you'll get back in there. It's kind of the way that is kind of shaping up to be right now, based on everything we're kind of seeing and hearing.
So I was reading Dogs HQ, and I saw Glenn Schumann, the defensive coordinator, the other day was talking about the role that Mykel Williams is used in, and they're kind of tweaking that. They're training him at several different places because he's versatile enough to do it. But it's interesting because Georgia's one where you have these guys that are potential like top 10 picks that are not huge stat producers necessarily. But like with Mykel Williams, how can they use him in different ways to drive an offense nuts?
Well, first and foremost, I think, a lot of folks are like, well, Mykel's moved to outside linebacker. Yes and no. The thing about Mykel is he's going to spend a lot more time in a 2-point stance. He's going to put his hand on the ground in a 3-point stance. I think Mykel Williams' days of playing inside the tackle, that 4-eye, if you're a football nerd, or 3 technique in some setups, I think those days are kind of, I don't want to say they're over, but I think they're limited. I think if Georgia got a little banged up or if there was a specific situation where they thought he was the best guy to kind of handle the situation there, I think he would still play, and I think he would do so, willingly with everything he's got. But I do think they can put him in situations more where he's playing out on the edge and maybe having some more I saw them do it against Tennessee. It's kind of hard to explain, where they kind of just turn him loose a little bit more. He had an impactful game there. They did it against Florida State. He had a really impactful game there. And I think that's something you're just going to kind of let him say, hey, listen, we're going to wind you up. We need you to stay in your gap, but we also need you to kind of wreak havoc and make plays. And he has that ability, especially when he's not even able to get to the quarterback. The way he's able to get his hand on passes and affect things that way, he's a really good football player. And like you said, he's probably not going to put up massive numbers. That hasn't been the case for anybody except for an inside linebacker in Georgia. But these guys keep getting drafted really high because everybody knows they're really good football players.
I'm sure Mykel Williams is thrilled about not being in a spot that leads to, sometimes 600 pounds of human being coming at him at once, especially if there's zone blocking, combo blocking to the linebacker, that sort of thing. Not fun to get hit by that. probably a lot more fun to be one-on-one against an offensive tackle on the outside.
Yeah, or drawing the tight end every now and then.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking of tight end, I'm glad you mentioned that because Georgia had a pretty good one. Brock Bowers, he's a Las Vegas Raider now. How do they – I don't know. Well, I think asking how they replace Brock Bowers is an unfair question because he's a pretty unique talent. But how do they account for that loss? Are we going to see more of Oscar Delp or Ben Urosic, the tight end that they brought in from Stanford, or Lawson Lucky was a young guy that they liked a lot last year? Like, how do they split it up between those guys?
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. There's no replacing Brock Bowers. There's no, I mean, that's something that I hope everybody in that room understood, and Kirby talks like they did. I think Oscar Delp is kind of an underrated athlete. I think he's a very athletic. I mean, coming out of high school, man, he was a little freaky. I mean, it was, he was kind of a borderline, tight end, but had played some receiver stuff, had been a flex guy. He's really put on weight and become like a full-fledged tight end. But I really do believe that he's going to be a big factor in this offense. The more I hear about the camp he's having, the more I kind of go back on I did bold predictions for every position unit at Georgia this offseason. I said Ben Urosic would Oscar Delp would lead the team in snaps, but Ben Urosic would be the most productive in the passing game. I don't know, man. I'm kind of maybe leaning back a little bit towards Delp. Delp was really good last year, just quietly, couple 2 or 3 plays a game, was really good when Brock Bowers was on the shelf last year. He did a really good job. And so I think that, I think it's his time now. And he's a much different player than he was, a couple of years ago when he kind of struggled with some drops and things like that. But I still think Ben Urosic is going to be a factor. I still think he's going to do some really productive things for Georgia in the pass game. I think he's going to give them kind of a downfield threat at that position, somebody they can flex out to maybe try to win one-on-one battles. I don't know that they're going to keep handing it to him like they did with Bowers and Stanford did with Urosic, but I do know they're going to ask him to be a more complete tight end, and I think they're going to take shots with him. And then Lawson Lucky is kind of, in his own way, is probably the most like Bowers. He's probably not quite as freaky athletically, but kind of in that H-back mold, a little bit undersized if you're starting to talk about, your ideal tight end. But he is a factor in the pass game, man. He's a very quick route runner, and he's going to be a factor. I would also say that, listen, when Georgia won it in 2021, they went 4 deep. It was Darnell Washington. It was Brock Bowers. It was John Fitzpatrick. I mean, there was another guy in there. There was at least 3 or 4 guys in there, and they'll go as many as 4 deep. And when they do, you start looking at maybe Jaden Riddell, one of the top tight ends in the country from this past year's class, probably the best athlete in that room, maybe getting an opportunity as well.
And so it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think about when Bowers was banged up last year. I think about when Ladd McConkey got banged up last year because I'm kind of lumping the tight ends and the receivers together here in terms of passing targets for Carson Beck. But they hit a stretch, and I think the SEC championship game was a good example where the depth showed, or the lack of depth showed. They had to kick Rara Thomas off the team. Yeah. So between receivers and tight ends, where does that depth come from? How can that be different this year?
Well, I mean, I think they did a good job adding in the offseason. I think they did a good job of, they went out and added 3, receivers this offseason. Losing Rara Thomas hurts because it causes some shuffling there that, Georgia at split end at that X receiver position, Rara was expected to be the guy. And I'm telling you, there's no shortage of folks inside that Georgia practice facility would tell you, listen, Rara is a Sunday player. And so that's a loss. That stings. But now what happens is Dylan Bell kind of flips over and plays that X receiver position. Colby Young, who's still learning the offense, but has a pretty good grasp, enough of a grasp to have a hellacious spring and a good camp thus far, even though he's a little dinged up. I think he gives them kind of a 1-2 punch there. You've got Arian Smith and London Humphreys there on the other side. And then you've kind of had Anthony Evans and Sokovie White both emerge this spring and summer. as guys who I think can help this offense bring. You kind of got a little bit of a lightning in a bottle there with Sokovia White. Kind of a quicker than fast, a tough guy to cover, and then with Anthony Evans, you've got another 10-3, 10-2 100-meter guy who can absolutely fly. So Georgia's got a lot of speed at receiver. They've got a lot of experience at receiver. They've got a core group of guys that played a lot of football. But losing Rara hurts them. But I do think they have that depth. And one thing I will point to last year is, man, when you take, you pointed to that lack of depth, and you're right 100%. But I think it's a lack of depth that just about every team in America is going to deal with, because you lose 3 of your top 5 receiving options, and that's going to hurt an offense. And that definitely hurt Georgia's that night. That and the fact that they couldn't convert 3rd and short.
Dominic Lovett, at this point, is he kind of the bell cow receiver there?
I would imagine so. I mean, I'll be very surprised if he doesn't lead Georgia in catches, because he's kind of he's the now guy. He's the, hey, let's get it to him quick guy. He's a slot fade, stretch the field type guy, and then he's also kind of the 3rd down target there as well. And he's another. If you go back and look at the stats and look at the games in which Brock Bowers either didn't play at all or came out of the game altogether with injury, Dominic Lovett had a serious uptick in production in those games. I believe he caught all of his touchdowns in those games. I want to say he averaged like 18 or 19 yards per reception. It was something, pretty crazy like that. And, 60, 70 yards receiving a game in those situations as well. So I think that he's a guy, when you start talking about Brock Bowers being gone and kind of how they move into that spot. Well, last year we got a little bit of a glimpse of it, and it meant more Dominic Lovett and meant more out of the slot receiver.
So we know all about Carson Beck, and he's firmly entrenched. The news at Georgia was they took Jaden Rashad out of the transfer portal, but it's still Gunnar Stockton as backup QB right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that that's going to change, or even really has an opportunity to change, Andy, until probably after at least the first bye week and maybe the second. I think it's just going to take Jaden Rashada some time. I don't care what offense you're running. If you're coming in with a halfway decent quarterback that spent 2 or 3 years more in that particular system than you have, you're going to be playing catch up. Just simply because, not necessarily that you're playing catch up as a football player. You may be a better football player, but when in terms of earning the trust of those coaches and them being able to kind of carry over as much of their offense as they possibly can, the guy who's been around longer is just going to have the leg up. I mean, I've seen Jaden Rashada throw the football since he's been at Georgia. It comes out of his hand really well. He's a smooth athlete. He moves around really well. But right now, Gunnar Stockton, who is also a really good athlete and has had a pretty good camp, it just has a pretty big leg up on him, and I don't think that has a chance to change within the next month or so.
So this is a question I want to pose to all of our guys as they cover camps, because I think this is one of those that we get so firmly entrenched in our offseason narratives. And I want to talk to the people who know the teams the best to see how accurate we are. So, Jake, is there a game on the schedule that, like, most of your subscribers at Dogs HQ would say, this is an automatic W, no chance Georgia loses this game, that you look at and go, this one might be tougher than everybody thinks?
Yeah, that's a good question, Andy. That is a really good question. I'm going to say that Auburn game, especially if they beat Alabama.
You might say that.
I'm going to say that Auburn game, especially if they beat Alabama. Like, if they lose to Alabama, Auburn might be in trouble. Auburn might be in trouble. But if Georgia goes into Tuscaloosa, especially if it's an emotional, hard-fought win, I think that might be one to circle. And I say that as somebody who is fully aware that since the year 2007, Auburn has come to Athens to just get absolutely slaughtered. Like, it is. I mean, even when they haven't gotten beat bad, they came in with the full expectation of winning, and they got their hearts ripped out. So, I mean, they haven't won in Athens since 2005. But I think that if Georgia beats Alabama on the road, that Auburn's going to be a little bit of a war.
Yeah, and Auburn played them so tough last year, even though Auburn's offense wasn't that great. They did put up a fight. figured out a way to get some chunk plays. Georgia turned it over and helped them out a little bit. I mean, that was absolutely how that thing went. I'll tell you this, Andy, if we get to that Sunday when the lines come out,
And Vegas, there's two ways to look at this. If you're like, ooh, that's high, they're sucker betting you, trying to get you to kind of, to bet on Auburn. And I think this is one that, looking ahead, Vegas can try to make some money out of that game, because if Georgia beats Alabama.
Well, and the thing is, with this schedule, like, it's another thing to consider. Georgia's toughest 3 games are on the road.
Yeah.
Look, and now
you could say maybe their toughest 4 if you wanted to have the debate between Kentucky, Tennessee, and maybe even Auburn.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And you make a great point about Auburn the week after Alabama. And that's the thing. The cumulative effect, especially in the SEC, and this is, as I look at some of these schedules, obviously we've talked about it a ton with Florida and with Oklahoma because their schedules are just on paper so hard. But just the idea that you've got to play these games, the Florida game is not right after the Texas game. They do have the week in between those. But like the Tennessee game is a week after they play at Ole Miss. Like, that's tough back to back.
Yeah, it is. And the reason I circled the Alabama one more than anything, I think Georgia would be able to go. I think Georgia would, to borrow from Eli Drinkowitz, what did he say? We stand on business. I think Georgia would be able to stand on business after beating Texas, with Texas being Texas. There's no history there. I think Georgia will be able to stand on business if they go and beat Ole Miss at Ole Miss and kind of handle the next week, even though Texas, they have the bye week. But, man, there's just something about Alabama being Georgia's version, a relative version of a boogeyman. I mean, literally the only team Georgia has lost to since 2020, okay? The only team that Georgia has lost to since that year. And we'll say every time they've played them outside of Mercedes-Benz in that time, they've beat them. But I just think there will be an emotional not just with the players. I think there might be a little bit of emotion there with the coaches. As hard as they try, we're all human. And I just looked at Auburn. Yeah, I don't necessarily think Georgia will lose it, but I think Auburn's in a good spot on Georgia's schedule if you're trying to get a signature win and put this, bring this team back down to earth.
As I said, if you have to play Georgia between the hedges, that's probably the week you'd want to do it. But getting back to the Alabama thing, how much do you think Nick Saban not being there changes the math on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to kind of believe certain things that come out of the collective mouth of the University of Georgia athletics. And I say that, it's kind of like, do I think that they ever made the Alabama game bigger than any other game? Yeah, I totally did. But I don't necessarily think that was because of Nick Saban. I think it was because of the colors and the script on the helmet and just what Alabama was and what it represented. And I still think that's what it means to them. I don't think you can really forget. And this is why I've been fascinated by, a couple years ago when Georgia beat Alabama in the SEC championship game, that following season, there was talk of a revenge tour all year long. And you haven't really heard anything about Georgia, not being able to win the third one, maybe possibly being a little ticked off and being on a revenge tour of their own. And I think if there's any game where that kind of spills over and becomes the issue, I think it's going to be that Alabama game. And I think that's going to be a very emotionally taxing for Georgia, win or lose, but especially, winning a big one in Tuscaloosa. I think it'd be very emotionally taxing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, for everybody else in the SEC, Georgia's become the measuring stick. But for Georgia, Alabama's still the measuring stick.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they definitely measured themselves by that. And listen, if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm sitting here saying, well, sorry, you have your championships. You hadn't beat us. We still kind of got you. We've got you by the short hair, and that's just the way it is. And I just think that's, it's a tough dynamic for Georgia fans to swallow, but it's just the truth. And that's the multitude. I think that game is so important for Georgia, especially when you start talking about kind of this era. And listen, if you want to take over in the post-Saban era as the dynasty, as the team, as the absolute unquestioned standard in college football, I don't care what Ohio State does this year because Georgia's kind of built the past. I think that you've got to win that game in Tuscaloosa in a year in transition, a year where I look at Alabama's team and I think they're going to be really good on offense, but I don't know anybody in the country. I don't think Alabama, maybe the Alabama pre-transfer portal of old could have done it, but the amount of phenomenal football players they lost on that side of the ball, on the defensive side of the ball, is it's got to be a little nerve-wracking.
So here's something that we don't usually get to say, I guess we'll be able to say it from now on, but we haven't been able to say it for a long time. We actually know exactly when that game is.
Yeah.
September 28th, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time.
Yeah.
On ABC. Like, we already know that. And that's one of the differences. We don't have to wait and see. Is that we back in the day, we'd assume that's the CBS 3:30 Eastern game, but maybe not. Maybe something crazy happens and they move.
Yeah, maybe they throw the doubleheader on it that week like they did back in 2020
Bingo.
when Georgia played there. Yeah.
Yep. So we know what it is. Night game, Tuscaloosa in September, for goodness sakes. Georgia still has to play at Texas and at Ole Miss after that. But man, that game, it's funny because I don't feel like we've talked about that game a ton this offseason. Maybe you guys have at Dogs HQ, but nationally, Georgia's playing at Alabama, for God's sake. We're gonna get to see that.
Yeah, and it's so exciting, man. It is. I mean, I would say probably Ohio State, Oregon is the number one. I don't know. I obviously I get excited about covering big Georgia games. Don't get me wrong, but I really look across the country and like what game am I excited to get in front of a TV or set up a second screen in the press box to try and watch? It's that Oregon Ohio State game. Like, I'm fascinated by that. But I'll be honest with you, like I'm going to be tuning into Alabama for the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season because I want to see what they look like. Like, I mean, it's how different than a Saban coach football team is it going to be? You know, I mean, like how are they going to be defensively with new coaching staffs and probably a new scheme and all of those things? You know, how are they going to, operate offensively? You know, what's the receiver situation like? How long is it going to take? Because I think the biggest key for that team is how long is it going to take for Jalen Milroe and Kalen DeBoer to really mesh and get on the same page, because I know they will in due time. He's that good of a coach. And that's going to be dependent on their season. And then with Georgia, you feel like you have more of a known commodity there. You kind of know what it is, but there's that little wedge that's sitting there between, that's going to divide what you think should happen and what's happened. And what has happened is Alabama's found a way to get Georgia whenever it's been big. And this one will be big.
And by the way, Georgia has to play Clemson and Kentucky before they play Alabama. So it's not like Georgia's just throwing up softballs before they get to the meat of the schedule.
It's one of those deals where if Georgia's healthy, Georgia's early season schedule has definitely helped it out. If it's healthy, Georgia has, it has paid huge dividends. If it's not, then you're left to question, well, if we played an easier schedule, would we be more healthy right now? Which, probably not. Players get hurt and all the time in less competitive games, all the time. And those maybe even feel worse.
Well, we saw Georgia loading up that schedule as this decade began. And that was kind of the hint to me that they were going to expand the playoff. Was
100%.
Georgia looked like they were planning, like they were doing the Tom Izzo thing, just load up and you'll be ready when you make the playoff.
And I'll tell you this too, man. I think Kirby Smart is such a football guy. I think he is such a, how do we play better? How do we perform better? That I really do believe him when he says one of his reasons for scheduling those marquee season openers is because the whole offseason is different. It's different because you're looking to that game one and you've got to be ready. I was told that last year when Georgia kind of had that very soft early season schedule, that Kirby really put it to him. Probably the toughest camp Georgia's ever had, as opposed to the year before when they had Oregon in the opener and, they kind of worked up to it. And Kirby didn't feel like he had to challenge the team. He knew that they would be challenged from the get-go, and he knew he didn't have to really push them because what was sitting in front of them would kind of push them. And I thought that was an interesting take on that. And I really do believe he subscribes to that thought, and it means a lot to him.
Well, Georgia, Clemson, August 31st. High noon in Atlanta. Can't wait. Jake Rowe, thank you so much.
You got it, buddy.
Thank you so much for watching. Just a reminder, subscribe to this channel right here so you never miss an episode of Andy Staples On 3. And oh, by the way, watch all the other great videos on the On3 Sports YouTube channel.